On the 27th of June 2000, police in Clinton, Louisiana were asked to carry out a welfare check on 42-year-old Genore Guillory after she didn't turn up for work. Genore was a reliable woman who had never been late, let alone completely absent without notice. As officers walked into Genore's home that afternoon, they were met with a scene so unnerving that even hardened officers felt a chill down their spines. In the corner of the room was the beaten and brutalised body of Genore Guillory. Blood splatter covered the floor, the walls and the ceiling, and the trail of destruction continued throughout the home. Lamps were knocked over, bloody footprints trailed down the hall, and even the once pristine curtains were stained with unmistakable crimson marks. There was no doubt that something horrific had occurred here, but what the investigation uncovered will shatter the small town's sense of safety and ignite one of the most perplexing and chilling investigations in Louisiana's history. As the investigation unfurled, it exposed a web of deceit and betrayal, bringing to light a darkness no one had anticipated. Genore Guillory was born on the 4th of January 1958 in Eunice, Louisiana. She was also known as a kind and independent person who doted as equally on her nieces and nephews as she did her animals. It was clear to those who knew and loved Genore that she wasn't the marrying type and was quite happy living alone in her house in Clinton. Except she wasn't really alone. The property had plenty of space for Genore to tend to her pets. There were at least 30 dogs on site at any one time, as well as 4 horses and a variety of abandoned animals she was nursing back to health. Her kindness and generosity extended to all living beings, and Genore was known as a very giving person. She was the first to help out a friend or a neighbor in need. In fact, Genore didn't even need to know the person to offer help. She often volunteered at community events and was known to give generously when it came to birthdays and other celebrations. Outside of tending to animals and her community, Genore worked as an administrator at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arkansas in Baton Rouge. She was a dedicated employee and had worked at the same job for over a decade. She was content to do a good job without worrying about career advancements, and her colleagues remember her as kind, gentle, compassionate, and generous. All of this was just a part of who Genore was, but needless to say, she was the type of person anyone will be blessed to have as their neighbor. And that's exactly how Amy and Philip Skipper felt about her. Amy and Philip were a young couple who moved into a trailer across the road from Genore with their young baby and Amy's 15-year-old son from a previous relationship. From the day they all met, Genore treated the family like they were her own kin. At times, Amy and Philip struggled to put food on the table, and their kindly neighbor would buy them groceries or supplies for the baby. When they needed funds to carry out maintenance on their trailer, they barely needed to ask before the money was in hand and the repairs were underway. When the repairs gave out, Genore paid for a completely new trailer to replace the old one. Things between the neighbors were so good that Genore even gave them a key to her home so that they could use the phone because they didn't own one. And the relationship appeared to be mutually beneficial. Whenever Genore needed to go out of town, she could always rely on Philip and Amy to feed her dogs and tend to her horses. After a while, it made sense for her to employ Philip to take care of the property while Amy was paid to clean Genore's home. So on the 27th of June 2000, when the police started gathering around the front of Genore's house, Philip and Amy immediately rushed over to see what was happening. That's when the officers broke the news. Genore was dead, and she had been murdered. To describe the scene inside the home as horrific would be an understatement. Blood trailed all through the house, from the front door, down the hallway, through the kitchen, and into the bedroom, which is where Genore was found. She was discovered half naked, and the blood splatter indicated she had been pinned against the wall by her attacker at some point before she died. The room Genore was found in was covered from top to bottom in blood. The window pane next to the bed had been shot out, another bullet had gone through the headboard, and her side table was on its end. At first glance, it was clear that Genore had been brutally beaten. Her head was caved in. Several wounds indicated she had been stabbed, and she had also been shot. It wasn't immediately evident whether Genore had also been, but given the state of undress and the fact that there was blood on her thighs, officers had to consider the possibility. Clinton, Louisiana was a place where murders just didn't happen. And if they did, it was most likely due to a domestic dispute or something else that clearly indicated who was responsible. But the responding officers sensed that this murder was something different, something darker. As soon as he found Genore's body on the floor of the bedroom, he called in the Louisiana State Police to process the scene. It remains one of the most violent homicides the Louisiana State detectives have ever worked on. During Genore's autopsy, the medical examiner found that her cause of death wasn't her 5 stab wounds or her 5 .22 caliber bullet wounds. The fatal injury was a blow to the back of her head, which severed her brainstem from her body. The medical examiner also determined that the time of death was between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Given the amount of DNA found under her fingernails, it was clear that Genore had fought for her life, and she was alive while the knives and bullets entered her body. If there was ever a murder that demonstrated the meaning of the word overkill, this was it. The extreme nature of the injuries made it clear that this was a crime of passion. Someone really wanted Genore to die a painful death. But who would want to kill such a kind, gentle and generous person? Her family were asked if there was anyone they could think of that would want to hurt Genore, but there was no one. There was simply nothing in her past that would give anyone reason to want her dead. Meanwhile, scene investigators found no sign of forced entry, which indicated one thing: her killer was likely to be someone she knew and possibly trusted. This realization only made the murder that much more confronting. Someone wanted to make sure Genore suffered. Right away, Genore's dependable neighbor, Philip Skipper, drew the interest of investigators. From the moment he had been told about Genore's death, Philip had remained eerily calm. And he seemed very keen to help, too keen. It was this odd behavior which made officers decide to bring him and Amy in for an interview, separately. That's when Amy revealed that their once blissful, almost family-like relationship with Genore had recently changed, thanks to an unfortunate accident. To make extra money, Philip began to breed pit bulls. He also owned another dog which was a different breed and who had recently started to become the target of the pit bull's aggression. Genore offered to kennel that dog at her property to help Philip out until the pit bulls were sorted. But one day, when Genore was at work, the dog got free from the property and ran back to Philip and Amy's home, where it mauled a pet goat they owned. Amy ran to Genore's home and used the phone to call her at work. Genore's co-workers only heard one half of the conversation, but even then, they could tell that it wasn't pleasant. Amy was yelling at Genore for not securing the dog properly. Finally, after taking an earful from Amy, Genore told her to leave her key on the table, get out of her house, and never come back. It seemed that things had become not so neighbourly between Genore and the Skippers. Except when the police questioned Philip about the incident, he said that it was all in the past and they had patched things up and put it behind them. That's when they noticed Philip had scratches running from the back of his hands up his arms. Philip told them that the scratches were simply from him play fighting with his stepson. He told the officers that on the night of the murder, he was at home asleep and that his stepson could account for his whereabouts. So officers brought his 15-year-old stepson, John Bellio, in for questioning. Just like Philip, John also had scratches running up his arms. He gave officers the same version of events that his stepdad had. They were play fighting, which is where the scratches came from, and they spent the evening together on the night of the murder. But something about their identical stories didn't add up. So investigators asked both men to take a polygraph test. Both men were questioned about their alibis and whether they had any knowledge of Genore's murder. To the officers' surprise, their answers showed no sign of deception. Remember that polygraphs are not admissible in many court systems due to their questionable reliability and potential for error. They can be a useful tool in gauging psychological responses that might indicate deception, but numerous studies have shown that they are not foolproof. Factors such as nervousness, fear, confusion, or even certain medical conditions can trigger responses on a polygraph that might be incorrectly interpreted as lies. Additionally, some individuals can train themselves to manipulate and pass a test even when they're being deceptive. Keep in mind that polygraphs measure psychological responses like heart rate, blood pressure, and perspiration, but these responses can be triggered by a myriad of emotions other than deception, including anxiety, fear, or anger. There's also the potential for the administrator of the test to introduce bias, intentionally or unintentionally, based on how they interpret the results or how they phrase their questions. Outside of the polygraph results, there was another factor to consider: motive. Genore was incredibly generous towards the Skipper family, and killing her would have put an end to that support, except for a decision Genore had made a few months before her murder. Genore had taken out a $25,000 life insurance policy, and the beneficiaries of the policy was none other than Amy and Philip Skipper. This would have been the perfect motive for the murder, except when investigators spoke to Genore's family, they all knew about the policy and there was no ill feeling towards the Skippers. They had spoken with Genore, and she wanted to make sure that the family was looked after if she wasn't able to do it for them herself. After ruling out the Skippers as possible suspects, the investigators turned their attention to other persons of interest. Tommy Alexandra was Genore's most recent love interest after her long-term partner had died 2 years earlier. The couple had met at a feed store when she was buying supplies for her many animals. Tommy asked Genore out for a drink, and they hit it off. But after a few more dates, Genore ended the relationship when she realized Tommy had a few other women on the go at the same time. When Tommy was interviewed about the murder, he told officers that he was at home with his girlfriend at the time Genore was killed. His girlfriend was able to corroborate Tommy's alibi, and he was ruled out as a suspect. That's when Genore's co-workers told officers about a man who had expressed interest in dating her a few months ago. After going on one date, Genore had turned the guy down. Despite the rejection, the man continued to pursue Genore to the point where he would sit in his car, watch her leave work, and follow her home. He would show up in front of her door unannounced and leave messages on her voicemail all hours of the day and night. It seemed clear that the guy had turned from a potential love interest into a stalker. The co-workers were able to provide the name, Steve Williams, and when investigators ran a check on his name, it turned out that he was none other than a probationary police officer. Tabitha McCanns was one of Steve's fellow officers, and she told investigators that the guy gave her the creeps. She had spent quite a bit of time with Steve at the police shooting range, and on a number of occasions, she had heard him having heated phone calls with a woman. He had also told Tabitha that he often shot targets at his mother's home, and the type of weapon he preferred was a .22. This was the same caliber that had been used during the attack on Genore. When they checked Genore's home phone records, they found 35 calls had come in from the shooting range in just 4 months. One of these calls was received on the day of the murder, and the man's voice had left a voice message which said he would be visiting her that day. As soon as the voicemail was discovered, Steve was brought in for questioning. Right away, his demeanor set off alarm bells for the detectives. He claimed that he had spent the night of the murder at his mother's house, which was just a 40-minute drive away from Genore's place, and when he was asked to take a polygraph test, the results indicated that he was possibly being deceptive. When investigators confronted Steve with these results, he refused to answer any further questions and he demanded a lawyer. Steve had shut down the interview, which only compounded the investigators' suspicions. They secured warrants to search his home and his vehicle in hopes that they could find something to tie Steve to the scene of the murder, but the search showed up nothing. No gun, no knife, no blood, nothing. This made them question whether Steve was innocent or whether his experience as a cop meant he knew exactly how to get rid of any evidence tying him to the crime. There was only one way left to determine whether Steve was the likely killer or not. Compare his DNA to the samples taken from under Genore's fingernails. The DNA from the victim was definitely male, but it was not a match for Steve, and it wasn't a match for anyone else on the police database either. It was yet another dead end. Police were at a standstill, and it seemed like they wouldn't solve the crime unless Genore's killer confessed or left his DNA at another scene. A year later, the case had well and truly gone cold. The community were attempting to heal while Genore's family continued to live with the fear of the killer remaining free to strike again. However, everything changed on the 27th of July 2001 when a tip came in from an officer in another county. The detective was working on a domestic case, and the woman involved let on that her partner was somehow involved in the murder of a person who went by the name of Miss G. The woman gave her partner's name as Donnie Fisher. When Donnie was brought in for questioning, he refused to say anything about the murder, but he quickly changed his tune when the detective showed him one of the bloodier photos which had been taken at the scene. Donnie began to talk, but it wasn't the confession they were expecting. Donnie explained that he had been told explicit details about Miss G's murder through a friend. The friend had been hired by Genore's family to clean up the house after the murder so that it could be put on the market for sale. The cleaner had paid Donnie to help, and while they worked, he took the opportunity to brag how the murder had gone down. That's when Donnie revealed the name of the person he believed to be responsible for Genore's murder, John Bailio. John Bailio was a stepson of Amy and Philip Skipper, Genore's trusted neighbours. At first, it seemed impossible that John could have been involved, especially given that his polygraph showed no signs of deception. But the more Donnie told them, the more it made sense. Everything from the direction that Genore had run through the house to the lamps that had been knocked over and what direction she was facing when she was stabbed. All of it rang true to the crime scene, and they were the kind of details that only the killer would know. An arrest warrant was issued for 16-year-old John the same day, and he was brought in for questioning. It took just an hour of intensive questioning for John to break, and the first part of his confession delivered a bombshell. John hadn't acted alone. His stepfather, Philip, had been right there with him, as well as Philip's brother and sister-in-law Lisa and Johnny. But there were many more shocking revelations to come. Genore's murder hadn't been financially motivated as investigators had once suspected. The truth was much, much darker than that. Despite Genore's kindness and generosity towards the Skipper family, there was one thing they couldn't overlook when it came to their neighbour. She was black. And it turned out that Philip, Lisa, and Johnny had recently formed a white supremacist group called the Brotherhood. John was expected to murder Genore as a test to prove his loyalty to the cause and to initiate him into the crew. To Genore, Philip was a helpful and community-minded neighbour, but behind her back, he called her dreadful names and plotted her death. That night, the group had been drinking heavily until the early hours of the morning. At around 2 a.m., Lisa knocked on Genore's front door and asked for money for the baby. When Genore opened the door wider, John pushed his way into the house. He chased Genore down the hallway as she screamed for her life. She attempted to grab a knife from the kitchen to defend herself, but it had little effect. Then Genore ran into the bedroom, where her attackers took turns beating, stabbing, and shooting her. Then Philip used a baseball bat to beat her about the head until she stopped breathing. That's when Philip and Johnny put condoms on and began to rape her body. This truth explains why there was no sign of forced entry into Genore's home. She had literally welcomed her killer through the front door. Due to John's confession, Lisa, Philip, and Johnny were all arrested and charged with first-degree murder. John Bailio was given a deal in exchange for testifying against his co-accused. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to a juvenile life sentence, which would expire when he turned 21. He was released from prison on the 10th of December 2005. Lisa Hoyt was also given a deal and received a sentence of 25 years. Johnny Hoyt and Philip Skipper were considered the instigators of the racially motivated attack, and they were tried separately. Philip Skipper was found guilty of second-degree murder, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Johnny Hoyt was also found guilty of second-degree murder and received a sentence of 25 years before being eligible for parole. Whilst the arrest and convictions are reassuring, one question remains unanswered. The male DNA found under Genore's fingernails was not a match for John, Philip, or Johnny. So who else was involved? Amy Skipper was never charged with any crime.
It's a dumb dog that bites the hand that feeds it. And Philip Skipper was a dumb dog. But much worse than that, he was a miscreant of the worst sort. May the flames of hell burn brightly for an eternity around him.